This episode has been brought to you in part by the Toronto Heschel School. You are invited to attend their open house on November 10th to discover what makes Heschel special. Visit torontoheschel.org for more details. That's Toronto, HESCHEL.org.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Benchwarmers, your bi-weekly look at the world of juicy sports. Gabe, how you doing, buddy?
You know, I'm doing great. It was my birthday this week. It was a lovely time. Thank you. We are nary a month from Hanukkah. The times are good. We're entering klezmer season, my friend. It is true klezmer season.
I'm excited for early Hanukkah. I think I mentioned to you the other day when we were hanging out that I'm very excited for Gentiles to wish me a happy Hanukkah at the end of December and get to tell them, actually, that was a month ago. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, for sure. It's a one time to say, I remember when I was a kid, I used to love the early Hanukkah because it meant like I didn't have to wait longer for the holiday. Like the holiday was sooner. Right. And then you got like two separate holidays when they're at the same time. It's really overshadowed, but this allows us to have our own time.
Sure. And then also like, the statutory Christmas of, Chinese food and movies, and then good sales on Boxing Day for those of us in Canada. We have a really great show today. We were joined by Dan Grunfeld, former college and professional basketball player.
A Stanford man.
The son of longtime NBA executive Ernie Grunfeld, who has written a really, really fascinating new book called By the Grace of the Game, which traces his family's, journey through the Holocaust. His dad's parents were survivors, and tracing his dad's career as an NBA player, NBA executive, his own life as a Stanford collegiate athlete and professional basketball player abroad. Really just a great, really, really fascinating book and a great guest to have on the show.
I think he was terrific. I think Ernie would be, very much described as like a macher in the NBA. Like if there is, definitely. If you could define a macher, it would be like that guy. And Dan has sort of had a great life playing basketball, following, he's very close with his father, talked a lot about his grandmother's story, escaping the Holocaust, and his own basketball career too. As well, working, in the Bay Area, with his second Stanford degree. It's very impressive. Really, really impressive guy and a really nice guy.
Definitely. I mean, it's sort of interesting. The book talks a lot, obviously, about his dad, about Ernie Grunfeld. We barely talked about it in the interview because the book is so fascinating otherwise. And, the story of the Holocaust and its effect on his family's life. We talk with Dan about how, as far as we know, Ernie Grunfeld is the only son or the only child of a survivor to play in one of the big four professional sports leagues. So pretty amazing stuff. Ernie Grunfeld obviously had a I think probably 10, 12 year NBA career. People might know his story of his playing time. I think they did a 30 for 30 about him and Bernard King.
They're very close friends.
Yeah, maybe not in the, I can't remember if it was the original 30 for 30 run, but it was maybe like 8-9 years ago. That's definitely a fascinating documentary. People should check out.
There's a pretty good Jewish geography in there. I'm not going to ruin it for you, but it's probably the most personal one we've had yet. But before we get to that, we have some fairly exciting, podcast development news here. We would like to welcome to the Benchwarmers Mishpacha our new intern, Jacob. Jake, we're actually on the air with Jacob right now. Welcome to the Benchwarmers.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Jake's our newest member of Benchwarmer family, interning for the Canadian Jewish News as a whole, and helped us out a lot with some great research on this topic, and has been reaching out to people, reaching out to guests. So welcome, Jacob, on board.
We have a usual producer, Michael. He's our standard, the executive director of the podcast and so on and so forth. And from what I understand now, legally speaking, Michael is your dad?
Yeah.
Basically. Haven't signed the papers yet, but that's pretty much where it's headed.
Unfortunately, Michael, while being an excellent podcast producer, doesn't know, I would say, a basketball from a hockey puck. Is that fair? Is that Michael's an occasional basketball fan, and I think that's about it, right?
He's a good ultimate player.
Yeah, he's giving us the thumbs up. He doesn't even want to talk about his lack of sports fandom. But
we're getting the slit throat sign, like the kill this conversation. So maybe we can move back to put put a little bit of the excitement on Jacob. Jacob, I
Yeah.
see you have a jersey in the back. Is that a Zach Hyman?
It's a Taylor Hall, actually. I wish I have a Zach Hyman Leafs jersey, actually.
Oh, nice.
I hope you listened to the episode where he was on our show.
Yeah, you'll have to get an 18 Hyman Oilers like Burger Shack does. Anyways, Jake, thanks so much for being a part of our team, and we'll have to check in later again. Before we get to our interview with Dan, Gabe, we should talk about recent pretty big Jewish sports news, which is, the most Jewish World Series ever. We've talked about this a bunch, but it ended up being a World Series that featured not just 3, but 4 Jewish baseball players, because backup Houston catcher Garrett Stubbs made it into Game 6.
We talk a lot about, the Mike Jacobs All-Stars, the players with Jewish names who are not Jewish. I would say Garrett Stubbs would be the inverse of that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't know.
You're Rowdy Tellez.
Garrett, yeah, exactly. Garrett especially. But, as we know, Jews come in all shapes and sizes and colors and creeds and all kinds of names as well.
This is very true. But a big muzzle tov to Max Fried and Jock Peterson, the Menches on the winning Atlanta Braves. Jock just got his 2nd straight World Series ring. And now he has some beautiful pearls to go with it.
I think Jock sort of stood out as one of the biggest personalities on the Braves team, wearing his pearls and, dyed blonde hair, smoking cigars right after the victory. That was pretty great. We should mention as well that there was an amazingly Jewish play when Max Fried was pitching in Game 6 when he was pitching to Alex Bregman flew out to Jock Peterson and right. So an all Jewish, pitcher hitter put out was pretty amazing. And, as everyone mentioned, it was the first time 2 Jews faced off in the World Series. 2 more Jewish World Series champions. Obviously, Jock Peterson already had one, but just a very all in all Jewish World Series. And I think you could see the amount of cavelling online for Jewish sports watchers, how meaningful it was to see all this and sort of marking the occasion. Baseball is a sport that's sort of marked by knowing what the history is and seeing this sort of first time ever Jewish face-off was I think very important to people.
We got a lot of tags of, there was a moment where Max Friedman pitched to Alex Bregman, who flew out to Jock Peterson. Is that the most Jewish moment in the World Series? I think, to bring it even full circle, the only reason Garrett Stubbs made it into the World Series is, he was the 3rd string catcher, the middle string catcher, the 2nd string catcher, MLB veteran named Jason Castro, whose wife is Jewish. But Jason Castro was unable to play, so Stubbs stepped in. But Jason Castro has a little Jewish connection there too.
Wow, that's very cool.
So it goes even deeper. If you include wives, maybe the Jewish contingent of your average World Series would go up a little bit more.
And I don't know if you saw it at the parade the other day, but Jock wrote an article right before the World Series about he wrote a Players Tribune article talking about one of the lines was about hanging out with the pitchers. And the pitchers were asking him why he was on their bus. And he said, y'all are the, I don't think we swear this much on the podcast. Y'all are the MFers who are going to win us a World Series. And made a little callback to that at the victory parade. Yelled out, we might not be a super team. We've only won 88 games, might have had our share of injuries and slipped below some people's radars, taken an unconventional path to get to the stage. But we also just might be those MFers. So he really, punctuated the Brave celebration, I think. And I think just a great guy to have on team. I think he's a free agent again. So it's sort of like, if Jock just wants to keep traveling team to team for the next 10 years, winning World Series, Knana Hora, right?
He's a real glue guy. Is there like a Yiddish term for a glue guy?
That Jake, the intern, that'll be on your list of things to research.
Find us a Yiddish word for glue. And I'm quickly doing a quick Google of how do you say sticky in Yiddish. It's just spelling out sticky for me in Yiddish.
Yeah,
so that's
not so helpful.
Oh, kleptic. It's like maybe a kleptomania sticks to your hands. Anyway, we're very proud of Jock and Max, and happy to chat about the World Series with them anytime they're interested. But let's get to our interview with Mr. Grunfeld. Why don't we?
Well, we're very lucky today to be joined by Dan Grunfeld. Dan, how you doing?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. We've asked you to come on to talk to us a little bit about your new book that's coming out shortly, By the Grace of the Game. And I'll give the full subtitle because I think it's a good one and very revelatory about what the book's about. The Holocaust, a basketball legacy, and an unprecedented American dream. Dan, can you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what the book's about?
Absolutely. So Dan Grunfeld, former professional basketball player. So I played at Stanford collegiately, 8 years professionally all over the world. My dad was a longtime NBA player and executive, Ernie Grunfeld. So he's very well known in the basketball world and in the sports world in general. But few people know that he's the only player in NBA history whose parents survived the Holocaust. So that was my grandparents. And thankfully, my grandmother is 96 years old, lives 25 minutes away from me in the Bay Area. She cooked for me yesterday, so I'm eating her food today, which is a good thing. But my book is kind of an intergenerational family story about how does a family get from point A to point B, and then what's the effect on subsequent generations. So tell the story all the way from the Holocaust to the NBA, and then my story with basketball as well.
This is somewhat of a sideways but thematically relevant story, which is that I found out today, and nobody else from our side knows this, but our dads, Dan, actually went to high school together.
Forest Hill, keep talking.
Yeah, exactly. Which is a very sort of Jewish way to bring in this story. And I guess my dad's a little bit younger than yours. He said he was a couple of years ahead. Although one of their teachers is a close family friend of ours, was a close family friend of ours. One of the teachers that our parents both had. But now, I guess almost 50 years later, we are talking on this podcast. So there's an intergenerational story to start this.
That's so cool. Well, I write a lot about Forest Hills in the book. You'll have to share the name of the teacher so I can tell my dad. I'm sure he'll remember, but that's
Absolutely.
So cool.
This is the earliest into an interview that we've ever devolved into Jewish geography.
It was going to happen anyway. Why wait? Right.
I think it's a forward evolution, not a de-evolution, but a forward evolution. But I'll send you the email name of Mrs. Nalvin later on.
I'm going to ask tonight.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it.
Her son certainly listens to this show, so he'll be thrilled to hear that.
Shout out to the Nalvins.
Dan, I'm glad you brought up your grandmother cooking for you, because this book is about family history, the Holocaust, and sports and basketball career as well. But I would say also reads a bit like a recipe book of some great Jewish Hungarian recipes. I won't even try the pronunciation on some of them, but it's just interesting to see that perspective of. I think a perspective shared by a lot of Jews of being fattened up by a grandmother.
100%. I've lived that life, and my grandma. We all think, right, our grandmothers are the best cooks, as we should. My grandma's amazing, and you read the book and you know this. Food in my family is really a vessel of love, because
Sure.
These are the dishes that my great grandmother made for my grandmother before she was killed in the war, right? So not only do we eat it and love it and bond over it, but I think there's a deeper history to it too.
So can you tell us a little bit, and again, I appreciate that it's hard to, summarize all these things, but a little bit about your grandmother's survival through the Holocaust and what her journey through that was like?
Absolutely. So my grandmother grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family in rural Romania, so on the border of Romania and Hungary. It's Transylvania. She was one of 10 children, grew up in a very happy household. She happened to be visiting a sister in Budapest when the Nazis invaded. And so she got a letter in the mail from my great-grandfather, and my grandmother was with her sister at the time, and it said, "Come home immediately." She packed her suitcases. They were ready to get on the train to come home, and they got another letter that day that said, "If you can, stay where you are." And that's the last correspondence that my grandmother had with her father. The whole family was taken to Auschwitz, and my grandma had a chance to survive. And so she was in Budapest on the run. And Raoul Wallenberg, Swedish diplomat, is known as one of the greatest heroes of the Holocaust, credited for saving roughly 100,000 Jews. My grandmother was one of them. So he issued false documentation, Schutz passes, which saved my grandma for some time. And she also risked her life to obtain 17 passes for other people. So I always tell folks, like, my grandmother's my hero, but she's also a hero. She literally risked her life to save others. She was eventually captured by the Nazis, placed in the Budapest ghetto. And at the end of the war, they saw the Nazis didn't come in the ghetto, but at the end of the war, they saw the Nazis enter with machine guns, and word quickly spread that they were going to exterminate all the Jews in the ghetto. And my grandmother and her brother, who was also there, they ran into an attic space and hid, and they were there for 10 minutes and 20 minutes and an hour, 2 hours. Eventually, nothing happened. Romanian and Russian soldiers came and liberated the ghetto. and my grandmother was freed. And it wasn't until 40 years later, when they made a movie about Raoul Wallenberg's life, that she learned that it was Wallenberg who went to the gates of the ghetto and pleaded with the guard and said, don't kill these people, the war is over. And so he saved her life twice during the war, but it took her 40 years to figure out that there was 2 times.
And you mentioned a second ago, I just want to go back to that there's, I guess a legacy of 17 other families that your grandmother helped save. In working on the book, as you look through a multi-generational storyline, did you find any of them?
My grandmother wouldn't even be able to find them because they were just people who needed help. She happened to get a note that said there was a long line to get to the front of the doors of the embassy to get a pass. And she got a note that said, you can come to the front of the line, because she had forgotten some papers, and they never took the note from her. So she kept using the note to go to the front of the line and get pass after pass. Initially, it was just for her sisters. So she got 2 passes for her sisters, but why stop there? So, and she told me, because I asked, obviously I did 1.5 years of research. So I just asked every question I could think of. And I said, did you get them for your friends? Who'd you get them for? And she said, some people I gave them to were friends that I knew, and some were just strangers who needed help. And, that's kind of, it would be amazing to figure out who those people were. I'm not sure we'll ever be able to.
Moving on a little bit past the war, obviously your grandparents moved to America, and your dad as well, who was born in Romania, moved to America as well. And sort of, it's sort of amazing to think of, one generation surviving the Holocaust, fleeing from Nazis, living out the war in the ghetto, in the Budapest ghetto, and the next generation, playing in front of 20,000 people at Madison Square Gardens and playing basketball around the NBA.
That's why I wrote the book. It's a really improbable story. My dad grew up under communism, came to America when he was 9 years old. He had an older brother who was diagnosed with leukemia upon arrival in the States, and he died within a year, which is a great tragedy in my family. And so for my dad, as a kid in New York City in Forest Hills, Queens, he just went to the playground because that's what all the kids in the neighborhood did, to learn English, to make friends. And he just started playing basketball. And it's funny because, I was a basketball player myself, and I grew up so differently. And I speak pretty honestly about that in the book. I grew up with so much privilege. My dad was the general manager of the Knicks. I had, examples and resources and all these things. When I was playing basketball, my mom drove me to every game. My dad was working with me on the weekends. For my dad, my grandparents never saw him play basketball until he was a junior in high school. They were immigrants in New York working. And, that I tell the story in the book, they just got a call at their fabric store that said, hey, from my dad's high school coach, said, you have to see this kid play. And he was an All-American high school, college, and the rest was history.
And at 6'6", I think probably the tallest Jew in New York in the 1960s.
he was amongst them for sure. Listen, he was a big dude. He's a strong dude, and the game just clicked for him.
And you talk, obviously you go into your sort of history in the book and how that became you. But, when did you decide, how did your career sort of help itself first to become a basketball player, and then to take your shot playing pro, and then going to write this book? Did it ever occur to you, maybe you want to go down the executive path that your father did?
For sure. So regarding my basketball career, I was born around the NBA schedule, right? Like literally my birth was scheduled to coincide between 2 road trips of my dad, so he could be there for my birth and my bris, right? So, I was literally born into the game. And people listening to this could appreciate that. This is
I was expecting you to say that you were circumcised, in the training room at Madison Square Garden.
It wouldn't have surprised me. It could have been the trainer doing it, right? They didn't even need a moil. But that's all to say, right? The game is just kind of part of my DNA. And what kid doesn't want to be like his dad? So I always grew up knowing that, hey, I want to do this. And to my dad's credit, he never once forced the game of basketball on me, and my mom too. They just kind of supported me and gave me space to do the things that I wanted to, but I just wanted to do that. And so my basketball career always flowed naturally from that. Upon retirement, of course, I always considered, doing what my dad has done for so many years, which is being an executive in the NBA. I went to business school upon retirement and working in tech currently. But listen, the game is always a big part of my life. I have many friends in the industry, and you never know.
Just touching on something you just talked about, your parents and pushing into the game. I really loved the anecdote about your dad showing up in Milwaukee and asking, are there any Jewish women around who might be interested in me? And immediately being set up with, someone saying, oh, what about Larry's or Jerry's daughter?
Right.
I think she's single, and being set up with your mom. I thought that was a very funny and specifically Jewish anecdote.
100%. That's how it happens, and my dad was introduced to a Jewish family in Milwaukee, when he was drafted by the Bucks. And literally that's, one of the first questions, 22-year-old Jewish guy in Milwaukee. Hey, any nice Jewish girls? And my mom's dad was an original owner of the Milwaukee Bucks. This is when it was more of a community, endeavor.
Back when you could just be like a successful lawyer and own a part of a team instead of like, you started the biggest software company in the world kind of thing.
That's exactly right. So my grandfather, he was a successful lawyer in Milwaukee. And so, yeah, that's right. And so, that was the first name that this family mentioned, Nancy Kahn. Right. And so here we are all these years later.
Congrats, I guess we should say, about the Bucks' recent championship. Does that resonate for you? Are you a Bucks fan in your own rooting interest, or has the family tie gone away?
I root for the team because I have friends there, and my family has very deep ties there. That's where my mom's born and raised, and I mentioned my grandfather. So I do root for them, but it's, since my dad has been at different teams and we've moved around a lot, I've had a lot of different kind of affiliations, but I was very happy to see the Bucks win it. It was awesome.
I want to go back to a second to talking about your dad's sort of upbringing and yours in New York. I'd imagine that his life of basketball on the playground was a little bit more Jewish than basketball is now. And, of all the Jews to come out of, New York and Chicago and the cities back then, in the 60s and 70s, it's amazing to know that his parents were the only Holocaust survivors. He's the only child of survivors, like you mentioned. But we talk a lot about on the show that, basketball 50 years ago was fairly Jewish. Mm-hmm. So I just found that to be an amazing story.
Absolutely. Yeah. You read the book. I talk about in the book, the roots of basketball and Judaism, how they intersect. And, of course, the first basket in NBA history was scored by Ozzie Sheckman, who's a Jew, and it was the New York Knicks versus the Toronto Huskies, and all 5 starters for the Knicks were Jewish. Jews were very prominent in basketball in the early days. And, it's the tradition is still there. Maybe there haven't been as many Jewish NBA players nowadays as there have been in the past, but the tradition's still there.
Well, we chatted last time on our podcast. It was right after they released the NBA, the 75th anniversary team, and Dolph Schayes, who had been on the 50th anniversary team as well, was on the list. And people online were having a bit of fun with, I think, his inclusion, because if you can find footage of Dolph Schayes playing, it's very much of a different era of two-handed shots and him being a 6'8" center who shot 38% from the floor. It's not exactly up to the modern standards. So, I don't know. I guess there's a reason why Jews aren't dominating the game anymore, but it is amazing to see a time when the game was ours kind of thing.
I hear that, but I will say it's hard to compare players from different generations, because even if you look back in the 80s when my dad played and you look at what guys were doing, it pales in comparison to some of the things that are happening now. But I'm always a big believer of you have to make those comparisons for inside of those generations. And when Dolph Schayes retired from the NBA, he was the leading scorer in NBA history.
Right.
So nothing more to be said for me.
Hey, look, we're a Jewish sports podcast. We're definitely Team Dolph.
Yeah, I get that, no doubt.
When you were playing, from your time in the NBA and overseas, was there ever another Jewish player on the teams you played on?
Well, in Israel, for sure. Right?
Yes, we were getting there. But
I played professionally in Israel, of course, but no, not at like the ultra competitive levels. That there weren't. Yeah, not in college and not professionally, aside from Israel.
Sorry, go ahead.
Do you feel like you stood out
in terms of, or do you mean did I stand out or did I not fit in?
That's your interpretation. Dealer's choice.
Yeah, there you go. It's interesting. So my rookie year in Germany, I played for a team in the first division Germany, which by the way is a whole other thing. And I wrote this in the book. I'm probably the only professional player who had to call his grandmother to ask permission to sign his first contract. Right. And I did. My agent called me today, and I got a great situation for you. I said, "Oh, I'm psyched. Where is it?" He goes, "It's in Germany." I said, "Okay, let me call my grandma," and I did that.
Yeah.
And her being the most amazing person in the world as she is, she said to me, she calls me Tatala, right? Which is like a Yiddish term, which I'm sure a lot of listeners have their own that their grandparents call them. She said, Tatala, sons are not responsible for the sins of their fathers, right? And she said, go to Germany, have a great experience there, which I did. But that year we had a lot of Americans on the team, and I had a teammate who wanted to say a prayer before the game. And he pulled me aside and he kind of asked my permission in a sense, because he knew I was Jewish. He said, hey, are you comfortable? Which I thought was very considerate. I said, of course, man, do it. But listen, there's at times certainly, a little bit of a different feel just because I was the only Jewish player.
Right. That's much more considerate than what we've heard from some other athletes, which is that, whoever was the team, whoever had sort of taken on the role as the team chaplain had tried to convert them at some point, especially in baseball. That's a story we've heard, and football too, I guess. So one other thing I want to ask you about, the foreword to the book is written by Ray Allen, who I think has been very, very public in his, role in terms of Holocaust education, being on the board of the National Holocaust Museum. Was that, you can talk about Ray Allen and your connection with him and his connection to the Holocaust, but is that something that you ever discuss with fellow players or other people in the game who you met, that, their understanding of the Holocaust and what, if any, sort of, research or interest they had in that?
It's not something I talked about often when I was playing, and it's not something my dad discussed very much either. I did when I played in Germany. My best friend on the team was German from Berlin. He was a national team player, and he and I had some deep conversations. And I write about this, right, because his family was on the other side of that war, and so he has a history that he carries too. And so we kind of discussed those things, but it's not something I talked about that much. And Ray writes this in his foreword. Ray and my dad was the general manager of the Bucks when Ray was a star player there. So I've known Ray for a long time, and as great as of a basketball player as he was, he's even better human being. I mean, he's truly a remarkable person. And he didn't know about my dad's parents, and he'd been to our house and they'd spent hours together. And I know Ray well, but it just hadn't been something that my dad talked about much, or, that I really talked about much. And so it was, first of all, amazing for him to step up for my family, for the story. And he's been an amazing advocate of Holocaust education and remembrance. But, that hadn't been something that I talked about that much with teammates.
I think, I should say, I think it's a really valuable project, and, it's a great story of, an American family, what it means to, where you come from and what that means to someone. And, a great narrative of a Holocaust survivor story. And sadly, there are fewer and fewer survivors left. It's amazing to be able to get this, get these stories on paper and available to people to really understand what it means.
I'm grateful. I appreciate it. My grandmother, I said she's 96. I'm really lucky for so many reasons, but her memory is like as sharp as they come. So when I did the research, I was digging in and asking her really specific questions. And so I think the book benefited from how amazing my grandma is, because she was able to provide these really, really vivid details that I tried to convey in the story. And so, these stories are priceless, and particularly for the Jewish people. And my grandma is always kind of, as I was growing up, and even today as an adult, has stressed the importance of telling the stories, because if we don't, no one else will, and so it's just, really my mission to share that story so others know.
I just want to mention a quote here that you mentioned in the book while we're on the subject of the Holocaust here. You say there are 4 major sports leagues in the United States: the NBA, the NFL, the NHL, and MLB. Of all the players who've played in all those leagues, my dad, talking about Ernie Grunfeld, is believed to be the only one whose parents survived the Holocaust. I think that's really an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing to highlight. As far as I can tell, I think you're right, and I'm sure you did the research into this.
Listen,
it's impossible to know the answer for sure.
I talked to every league, every historian, every Jewish sports historian. No one could find anyone, but that's why I said it's believed to be, because you never know. And it wasn't only Jewish people who were affected by the Holocaust.
Yet somehow you missed us in that research. Just saying.
You didn't return my emails, man. Come on, I was trying to get in there.
Yeah, but I would say I don't think it's a challenge per se, but I would say that if anyone does know of anyone else who's the child of survivors, we definitely be interested in hearing it. And I think the Jewish sports fan community will find those people if they know of them. They'll let us know. But I think it's such an interesting thing to think about. I mean, we've talked before on our podcast about the disruption of World War II and the Holocaust on Jewish lives and Jewish lives in sports, Olympians from that era, athletes from that era who were taken away in their prime. But, it's interesting to see just sort of the legacy of survivors and their kids and whether they've been able to, be involved in sports in those ways.
And because you read the book, my grandfather was one of those athletes because
Right.
he was a world ranked ping pong player.
Right.
He was really an amazing ping pong player. He was also kind of a semi-professional soccer player.
I think the pros like to call it table tennis.
That's a fair point, man. That's a fair point.
It's very interesting to hear you come from such a legacy of athletics and sports involvement, and something we hear from a lot of athletes, and especially Jewish ones, is that there's a lot of somewhat of a community pressure to show sort of a maybe powerful is the wrong word, but a more athletic side of Judaism than a lot of the rest of the world seems to see us. Was that something that you or your dad or your grandfather ever lived with?
I think I can't speak for my grandfather. I know that my dad was very proud to be a Jewish athlete. He wore number 18 for the Knicks.
Right.
Obviously that's a very intentional choice.
You probably got a lot of fans very quickly that way.
Yeah, 100%. Ernie Grunfeld, number 18 for the Knicks. That worked. But yeah, I mean, listen, I think that there always is a little bit of an edge to because of our history. And for me, growing up with knowing what my grandmother went through, and myself experiencing anti-Semitism, and kind of some of the stereotypes around Jews not being great athletes. Yeah, you take a person a little bit. And I was actually in a class in college where we were talking about stereotypes of different groups of people, and when we mentioned Jews, someone said unathletic, and I actually made a comment, because at the time I was,
hey, I play for the basketball team.
Not only that, I was a first team All Pac-10 player at the time, and I let them know that, because so it did kind of like strike a chord with me. And yeah, listen, we're proud to be athletes. We're proud to be Jewish athletes. Yeah,
reading the stories about your dad playing for the Knicks wearing number 18, it's sort of mind-boggling to think that the Knicks haven't really had a Jewish player since. I mean, obviously Amari has converted to Judaism since retiring, and when he first went to the Knicks, that was, I think, the genesis of his interest in his own maybe Jewish heritage and being involved in that. But the failure to sort of capture that audience, I think, is sort of amazing, because you'd be the most popular Knick, I think, if you were, if they could trade for Denny Avdia or something like that, he'd probably be the most popular Knick on the team.
100%. I mean, huge Jewish population in New York City. Basketball in New York City is a way of life. And so I agree with you.
Well, I think we should probably end it there. Dan, thanks so much for giving us your time. This book was really a great read. I think it comes out at the end of the month. Is that correct? That's right. It's comes out November 30th, available for pre-order now. Anywhere people get their books, I'd be grateful just to, for people to experience the story. And, it's my honor to tell it, really, because what my grandmother, my father went through so I could have the opportunities I do, it was something that I needed to tell. So I'm grateful for the support. Well, thanks again to Dan Grunfeld for joining us. Really just a great read, and please check out the Grace of the Game whenever you have a chance. Gabe, there's been some other basketball news on the women's side. I think we should talk about. How did the WNBA finals go for? So unfortunately, our one of our Gadyas, or a well-known goat, Sue Bird, did not win the WNBA championship this year. She was the reigning championship last year. They lost this year. It was won by the Chicago Sky. Which is, they don't actually, unfortunately, they don't have any Jewish players, but they are owned by a Jewish man, businessman Michael Alter. He is a commercial real estate tycoon who also is the owner and chairman of the Chicago Sky. So a big mazel tov to Mr. Alter. But it was a very exciting WNBA season. No Jews to celebrate other than the ownership. But good for them. And there might be another Jewish owner coming to the WNBA as well. I mean, there was a story the other day that Drake wants to bring a WNBA team to Toronto, maybe. That would be, hey, if Drake could get involved in the WNBA, I think a lot of people would be very happy with that. Sure. Especially because, he was a big ambassador for the Toronto Raptors. Maybe him and some of the Jewish WNBA stars, we could recruit Sue Bird to play for the Toronto team.
That would be pretty great, I think, as well.
I think it'd be great. I mean, I think the city could absolutely support another basketball team, a WNBA team. Like, look at the way the Raptors 905 has like become a thing in recent years, the G League team. And
absolutely. But I mean, I think I'm just going to keep naming. You bring in Sue Bird, you bring in Alicia Clark, you make Nancy Lieberman the coach, and we've got the most Jewish WNBA team there is.
All right, next time we get Drake on the line, we'll have to pitch that to him.
We'll have to tell him about all of this.
Yeah. I'd like to mention as well that this episode has been brought to you by the Toronto Heschel School. You're invited to attend their open house on November 10th. To find out what makes Heschel special, visit torontoheschel.org for more details.
Is the Heschel School still across the road from Amazing Donuts?
I have no idea. I'm going to say no.
Have they moved on from Adith Israel?
I think Amazing Donuts might have moved on.
Yes. Okay. We're getting it news live from our intern that the Heschel School is no longer inside Adith Israel.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
It's at Wilmington and Bathurst, I believe.
Oh, there you go.
Did you go to Heschel, Jake?
I went to Leo Beck. I know I have friends that went to Heschel though.
Yeah. There you go.
This is the other kind of Jewish geography. Just literally, where are the Jewish schools located? Anyways, until next time, we're brought to you as always by the Canadian Jewish News. You can read everything that the Canadian Jewish News puts out for free, no paywall, at thecjn.ca. Listen to our great slate of podcasts. You know, we were lucky to be on the CJN Daily last week to celebrate their 100th episode. That was great. If you're listening to this on a podcast app, please like and subscribe to the podcast. If you're listening to this on the CJN's website, please ask one of your children or nieces and nephews how to listen to podcasts on your phone, and they'll show you how. And you can like and subscribe to the Menschwarmers there.
Thanks
and
again
follow us on Twitter at Menschwarmers.
Thanks again to Dan Grunfeld for joining us, and we hope all of you have a wonderful, what month is this? Adar? No, we're not in Adar. We hope you all have a wonderful couple of weeks until Hanukkah.
We'll get the intern on figuring out what Jewish month it is. Thanks again. See you next time.
The Limud Toronto Festival takes place on Sunday, November 21st. Limud features educators, performers, authors, activists, and innovators from around the world. The Limud Festival of Jewish Learning celebrates creativity, diversity, inclusivity, and discussion. Everyone is welcome. All tickets to Limud are pay what you can. Learn more at limud.ca.